Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Imperfectly Better, a podcast all about documenting the real time process of growth, learning, improvement, and change. I'm Cody. I'm your host. If this is your first time tuning in, hello. It's nice to have you here. If you're returning, then I appreciate your ongoing support. I can say with the recording of this episode, we have officially hit the double digits for listens. Not just on Spotify, but on multiple platforms. So that honestly has me feeling good about the growth of this. There's only 3 episodes out so far, but I do feel hopeful just seeing the way that people respond to it, how other people are showing interest in it, and all the feedback I'm getting so far on it. So, right now, I'm feeling pretty driven and pretty good to keep this up. With that said, let's get right into the podcast episode. So, this episode is actually not what it was originally supposed to be. So, this episode came up as a result of working through a recommendation somebody had sent on to me, which was the Solved podcast with Mark Manson. I had begun to explore the podcast episode on change, and that exploration led me towards other things like polyvagal theory, autistic struggle with transitions, and finding supporting material. And I was interested in what I was studying. I wanted to learn these things. So, what was going on here for me was not boredom or a lack of curiosity with the material. And it wasn't even that the podcast episode was long or that the supporting PDF for it was long. I could work through those just fine. And I could understand pieces of it while encountering it. But afterward, I just could not confidently explain what I had learned. It felt like throwing darts at a dartboard and watching every dart fall out. For me, not being able to get this in, not being able to really understand or comprehend it as I was working through it, was hitting me hard. Because Imperfectly Better is partly built around learning from ideas, reflecting on them, and carrying something meaningful into my life. And if I could not understand and retain what I had explored, then what would that mean about the podcast? To me, it felt like it might not even work. I was beginning to wonder if I was genuinely curious or just merely attracted to the identity of being a learner, of being a curious person. So I did not think that this learning process is not working. I thought, maybe I am not who I thought I was. Essentially, a problem with my process and this podcast had started becoming a verdict about me. So, seeing that I was struggling with this and that I needed to readjust, I took a step back and I began to explore what it meant to learn, what it meant to take in the recommendations, the material, the topics, study books, everything that I could study. And I discovered that I was silently holding myself to a standard. So a good learner, in my mind at that time, should be able to identify all the important details, follow information without falling behind, remember terminology, explanations, and examples, and be able to give a detailed summary afterward of what was presented to me. Essentially, to demonstrate that none of the time or information that had been spent studying had been wasted. And this intention was not bad. I wanted to take serious material seriously. I did not want to consume it like a funny video, briefly react, and then forget it. But the desire for depth quietly became a demand for comprehensive retention. I had confused learning deeply with retaining comprehensively. So 5 hours of information went into my ears, and I thought 5 hours of information had to remain intact inside of me. And I felt like forgetting details felt like proof that I had failed to learn. That failing to learn felt like proof that I could not become a public learner. I was not only studying the material, I was also testing whether I deserved to become the person that I wanted to become. And essentially, I was using an impossible standard of learning to measure my intelligence and worth. So, what did I initially try to overcome this problem? So, I had tried a few different things. I had tried listening more carefully. I had tried going back through and repeating sections of the podcast episode that I was listening to, questions that I was exploring, or things with, for example, polyvagal theory that I was trying to take in. In this regard, I tried to have ChatGPT teach the material to me. So I would have it present to me a chunk of information for comprehension and then present to me questions in order to test that comprehension. And essentially trying to make the process comprehensive enough that I could feel like nothing important was escaping. But the problem was that each solution I was creating was just creating another assignment. So now I was trying to consume, understand, remember, analyze, verify, apply, and reflect on every bit of material that was coming along. And I was trying to do all of that before I had developed basic familiarity with what I was studying. In essence, what I was trying to do was unhinge my jaw like a python and swallow an entire burger in one bite. I mean, I'm not Patrick. I can't swallow a Krabby Patty Triple Deluxe in one bite. So the problem was not necessarily that the burger was too large. It's just that, in normal circumstances, you usually eat it in quite a few bites. And I wasn't taking bites. So I had turned curiosity into coursework. And then I kept adding assignments and requirements and more onto that because the coursework was not working. So to clarify, difficulty was not the enemy here. The problem was repeating the same approach without gaining additional clarity, comprehension, or understanding. And more structure was not automatically better structure, and more effort was not automatically productive effort. What I had done was that I had responded to overload by constructing an even larger load. I had responded to the fact I could not swallow a burger in one bite by upgrading my effort to trying to swallow a whole turkey in one bite. After a bit of effort with this, I eventually had this thought of, what if I'm not the problem? What if there is an ideal approach for me for learning? Because I had spent 6 months working through a lot of material on my own as far as my own inner growth and development. I have read and listened to podcast episodes, audiobooks, all sorts of things in the past, and had things that resonated, things that I walked away with. So I knew I could learn. It's just that there is a best way for me. So I took a step back, reflected, and ended up applying a few things to my own process that helped out a lot. So the first thing that I did was that I made the material smaller. So instead of trying to hold an entire source in my mind, the whole terminology, the whole description of it, I began working with shorter sections and creating space to pause, respond to any reflection questions or things that were meant to apply what I had learned and taken in to my own life, having space to do that, and then orienting myself before the next chunk of information. So actually taking bites of what I was studying. The next thing that I had done was that I allowed my own notes to come first. So instead of beginning with everything a system said I was supposed to notice, so in this instance, everything that the follow along for the podcast episode that I had listened to and worked on, everything that it was highlighted in there, I paid attention to what actually stood out to me. And from my notes came the questions that I ended up answering. And the questions themselves were reoriented so that they weren't testing whether I had remembered the material presented to me. What they were reoriented to do was get me to explain what I thought the idea meant, to connect what it was that had jumped out to me in whatever it was that I explored. So in this instance, the Change podcast episode, and connect it to my own experience, to be able to challenge my own assumptions, notice where I might be wrong, and be able to walk away from that reflection process with comprehension. To summarize, my reflection questions in relation to the material became the place where comprehension developed, not the exam I had to pass after comprehension was already gained and present. And with that in mind, especially since my comprehension questions and reflection questions were based on my notes, what does that mean about the original source material? Well, it became a guardrail. So first I could form my own understanding by reading through the material, listening through the material, and taking my own notes. Then I could return to the podcast and reference materials and source materials to check whether I had represented it fairly, whether I had misunderstood an important distinction, or whether a term or a factual claim needed more investigation. And the great part here is that AI could help challenge me and generate questions, but it was not automatically the authority on what the original source said. In the instance of working through my reflection questions on the Change podcast, I included both the notes that I had written as well as the original source material. So essentially, there was this 3-point check between the notes, myself, and the source material in order to make sure everything was all accurate and lining up. But as far as notes go, and going back to the point of terminology, in this instance, what I had found out was that I didn't need to memorize everything. I didn't need to memorize every source in order to walk away with something meaningful. So, terminology became targeted. I did not have to memorize everything before I could begin reflecting. I investigated the terminology and the science and definitions when it affected my interpretation, accuracy, or something I needed to or intended to discuss publicly. So, in this instance, the source material and being able to reference the exact terms and explanations was a support tool. It was not the finish line. So the new method preserved both personal meaning and external correction. So what happened when I began applying all of this? What happened when I began to apply this new approach of reorienting the reflection questions around the goal being comprehension, and especially keeping in mind that I did not need to memorize everything, but more so approach the material like it's a menu at a restaurant, where you can't order everything on the menu because you're not a cow, you don't have 4 stomachs, but you do certainly crave something at that restaurant. Well, what I found with the new approach is that the evidence did not appear as perfect recall. It appeared while I was answering reflection questions. I naturally began remembering themes from the original podcast episode, specific details from the PDF, moments that challenged my earlier thinking, or places where my interpretation had been wrong. I was finding that I was not remembering or reciting the material from my notes or the terminology. I was actually using it. I was remembering and recalling the experience of what I had learned from it. And that original information had been processed into perspectives, questions, personal corrections, connections with other experiences and other details about my life, and even possible actions. So what I was finding was that I was applying what I had learned to my own life. So, yes, I had learned it. It was just that I had been searching for the wrong evidence of learning. I was looking for perfect recall, while the actual evidence was appearing in how I was thinking, how it was that as I worked through these reflection questions about how what I had studied applied to my own life, that I was able to just recall the lessons and the guidance and insight given in that material and exactly what path I should be going down for myself in order to improve change in my own life. And what was especially interesting was that I found I was able to just speak naturally about what it was that I learned. But I do want to clarify a limit here. Being able to speak naturally about something does not automatically prove that every part of your understanding is accurate. Exact terminology, factual claims, and representations of another person's theory still need to be checked against the source as well as researched into to make sure it is factual. But the source does not have to remain intact inside of your brain for learning to have occurred. So in this instance, a 5-hour source, a 5-hour podcast episode may eventually condense into one idea that genuinely changes me. Integration is not the preservation of everything. It is carrying something meaningful and usable forward. I do want to address an important point here, and something that might be a point of criticism for what I just talked about, or especially what my approach is that I developed for studying exploration and learning, which is if I'm just redesigning the process or avoiding the difficult parts of learning. And I do want to say that some serious learning can require repetition, memorization, practice, and self-correction, which in turn leads to frustration and slow accumulation of knowledge, bit by bit, day by day. And I was not trying to make every difficult subject feel easy. I understand that there are some areas that are going to be difficult to study, and that is just the nature of life. What I was trying to do was determine whether the difficulty I was working through was producing understanding. And as I reflected on this point and worked through it, because I do recognize that there will be times in my life where learning will be a difficult process. It is that I found this distinction. So there is productive difficulty and unproductive repetition. Productive difficulty gradually creates more clarity. It is that the more that you practice and repeat something, the better it is that you perform, the more clear things are as far as that topic or study goes. Think of it like practicing an instrument or practicing piano. The more that you practice chords, the easier it is going to be to play those chords. With that said, there is unproductive repetition, which means doing essentially the same thing again and again and again without any meaningful change in quality, performance, understanding, or comprehension. It doesn't feel like you are building yourself up bit by bit. It feels either like running in a hamster wheel or banging your head against the wall, hoping that the next time you hit your head against that drywall, you'll break through to the other side. And that is not a great way to learn. There's another thing to keep in mind about learning, and it's that the purpose of your learning also matters. Your why behind why it is that you're studying something. So someone preparing to practice professionally and present their knowledge publicly needs a different level of mastery than someone carefully exploring ideas for personal reflection or growth like me. My purpose was not to become an authority on these different subjects and not to even become an expert on polyvagal theory, for example. For me, my purpose and goal was to understand useful ideas, comprehend them, apply them carefully to my own life and experience, and be able to speak honestly about what I've found. So, application without accuracy can distort a source. Memorization without application can leave it unused. I needed both, but not in equal amounts. And depending on topic, depending on how it applies to your life and the importance of it, and how much you walk away from your exploration of something, those amounts will change. So to conclude, I did not remove the hard work. I redirected the effort toward the kind of understanding that was actually important to me and that I was actually seeking. What I want to do now is help out any listener or somebody following along that might be struggling with getting something that they're studying to stick, or finding that a given topic or information is just not hitting right for them. So, what I want to offer is the 1 bite check. So it breaks down to the following 4 questions. What exactly is breaking down? Is repetition producing any new clarity? What is 1 bite I can take? And what 1 variable can I change? So, kind of going through each of these. And the first question, what exactly is breaking down? Ask yourself if it's something like too much information, is the language too technical, do you feel like you're missing background knowledge, do you just feel tired, lacking attention, like your brain is bricking up, or that it kind of feels like trying to take in the information is like hammering nails into your head? Do you feel like you're lacking good examples that explains what it is that this concept that you're studying, this material that you're reviewing, applies to yourself or your own work or life in general? Is there uncertainty about what matters with the material that you're studying? Like, what is it that you're actually supposed to walk away with? Or is it just trying to complete too many learning tasks at once? There could be a variety of reasons, a combination of them, for why your learning process is breaking down. Don't try to hunt down an exact answer. Be open to the idea that multiple things can be true at once. For the next question, is repetition producing any clarity? Ask yourself, after revisiting this, can I explain a little bit more than I could before? Is this a bit more clear to me than it was before? Am I able to comprehend and understand it better? When it feels like the answer is no, and that no is not getting better, then stop blindly applying more force. Do not keep hammering away at the material in order to try and understand it better. Take a different approach. For the next question, what is one bite I can take? Take a step back, look at the material, and choose what that bite looks like. How it is that the source material that you're reading and studying from can condense. Is it a paragraph, a concept, question, example, something that connects to your own life or something you're familiar with, or a collection of terms? Whatever it is, if it allows you to digest it better, then that is the bite size that is best for you. Now, for the last question, what one variable can I change? Try something like a smaller section or a different explanation. Maybe you could speak the idea out loud or write it down. The brain processes information differently depending on how you work through it. It's going to process something that you're studying differently if you speak it out loud versus if you write it down versus if you read it or listen to it. It's going to activate different parts of the brain. Maybe taking more selective notes will help, or finding a concrete example that you can follow along with and connect to and be able to use that for better comprehension and understanding. It helps to understand what your wall is. Like, what is the wall between you and that understanding and comprehension of the material that you're studying? Because if you know what the wall is, you can figure out how to either go around it, go over it, or even break through it. But there is one important thing here that can help as well, which is rest. Taking time to rest, taking time to decompress, reset, and come back to the material. Because oftentimes, learning, change, growth, and development does not occur in one day. It occurs over the course of many days. When you study the material, leave, and then come back to the material. And you keep coming back to it. But you have those gaps in between where you're either doing something else, you're reading something else, or you are resting and relaxing Going back to what I've talked about in the previous podcast episodes, you need to give yourself permission to rest. You need to have awareness that if you're driving your car at top speed all the time, you're going to burn through all of your gas. And you cannot study, you cannot take things in if you run out of gas, because you're just not going to have the brain power, you're not going to have the energy to be able to form those new connections, to be able to build that additional clarity, comprehension, and understanding that you need. Bringing everything to a close here, what did the wall mean to me? What was it that I was running into? I was studying something that I genuinely cared about. It was a listener recommendation, my very first one, and I wanted to make sure that I did a good job and that almost none of it felt as though it was staying with me. At first, I treated that as evidence that I was not intelligent enough, not genuinely curious enough, and not capable of building the podcast and presence that I had imagined. But I did not let that fear determine the verdict. What I did was I took a step back, reviewed through things, and I changed the process. I reduced the size of the bite that I was taking. I let my own response emerge from reflection, and that reflection was aimed towards the goal of building comprehension and understanding of the source. And I used the source material for correction and guidance. And eventually, through all of this, I discovered that the material and what I had learned had actually stayed with me. It had simply taken a different form than the one I had expected. The wall was not proof that I could not learn. It was showing me where the process of learning needed to change. That brings us to a wrap with this podcast episode. Actually, one of the longest that I have recorded so far. And I will say that I did appreciate the challenge that I went through for what will be the next episode that I do. So really, this is the first of 2 episodes that I am doing. The next episode will be all about that Mark Manson episode on change, what it is that I learned, and how it was that I applied it to my own life. So, look forward to that. I'm going to have that out pretty quickly after I get out this one, because I worked on both of these episodes, referring to this one and the next one, together. If you would like to reach out to me with your own recommendation, your own questions, or things you would like me to explore and study, you would like my perspective on something, or you just have feedback for the podcast, there will be a link to a feedback form in the show description. Otherwise, you can find more information on my website, which will also be included in the show description, or if you look up Imperfectly Better, you should be able to find the Podpage website for that. Otherwise, I thank you all for listening and for sticking around with me, and I hope to have you back in the next episode. Bye.